Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Kiddushin daf Samach Zion. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So yesterday we got to the Mishnah at the bottom of Samach Vavam Bet, and so we're going to begin today by talking about lineage. How do we determine what the qualities of a person are? And so let's just dive right in, and we'll get a better understanding of what it is. And as we go through, I will note some things about specific language issues in the Mishnah. And that way, when we see them in the Gemara, we'll be more prepared. So, kol makom sheyesh kedushin ve'ein aveira, anytime that there is a marriage without any sin associated with it, havlad holech achar hazachar, the child goes after the father's qualities. So this is, of course, classically what we all know. The Ezazu, and what cases are we talking about? Zu Kohenes Leviyavi Israelis, a female Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael, Shenizu Lechohen Levi Yisrael, who gets married to any of those three qualities, either a Kohen, a Levi, or Yisrael. So then what do we determine? How do we determine which grouping the child is? We determine it by looking at the father. And so the child of a Kohen is a Kohen, the child of a Levi is a Levi, the child of a Yisrael is a Yisrael. Even if the Yisrael is married to a Bas Kohen and she's a Kohenes, we're still going to follow the father based on this Mishnah. This Mishnah explains that. Now, I want to highlight the two language issues that I mentioned that I was going to reference. And the first one is, look at the very beginning of the Mishnah. It says kol makom, everywhere. That suggests that this is a broad category, that it may include multiple situations, maybe even more than the ones that are listed. That's point number one. And the Ezazu, and then we say, which ones are we talking about? That suggests that maybe there are cases that are officially in the category of betrothal, of marriage and no transgression, meaning Kiddushin ve'ein aveira, right? There you can do the Kiddushin without having a sin, and yet you will not actually follow the father. Maybe you'll follow the mother, or maybe you'll follow the nature of the, or maybe you'll follow, an alternative situation. We'll see that there's sometimes that we're going to follow the parent that has the blemish, whatever that blemish may be. And so as a result, we've got in this first statement, both an inclusive aspect to it, that maybe it includes more than what is just listed, and an exclusive aspect to it. And we will see both of them will come into effect in our discussion in the Gemara. So that was case number one. Case number two, anytime when it's possible to get married, but there's a sin associated with it. What's the story in that situation? Havlad holech achar hapagum. The child will follow whichever parent and whatever blemish exists in the parent. The Ezazo, what's that situation? Zo almana lekohen gadol. This is like a widow who marries a Kohen Gadol, a gerusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyot, a divorcee or somebody who has gone through chalutza. That's where you have an opportunity for yibum, and you say no. Then the woman performs the chalutza ceremony, and she becomes a chalutza. It's as if she's divorced, and therefore she cannot marry a regular Kohen. Or mamzeres unesinuli Yisrael. Those are, mamzer is a child born from certain inappropriate marital relations. Or Natina, that's one of the Jews that effectively did not become Jewish in an appropriate manner, and as a result, historically, and as a result, were sort of separated and were not supposed to marry them. Bas Yisrael mamzer ulenasin, or not just the man marrying a female mamzer or a female natin, but a male mamzer or a male natin marrying a female Bas Yisrael. Okay, so all of that is category number 2. In each case, even though you might say, well, are supposed to follow the father, and the father is a fine Yisrael, or a fine Levi, or a fine Kohen. No, tough luck. The child is not going to follow just the father. Rather, the child is going to follow categorization of the mother if the mother has an issue. And so that's why the child of a mamzer will always be a mamzer. Okay, or at least in this situation. We'll talk about how possibly a mamzer can have children that are not a mamzer, I believe, over the course of the coming weeks. So, misha ein la alav Kiddushin. Now we're ready for category number 3. If Kiddushin itself is not possible, Aval yesh la al acherim Kiddushin, but but there is the possibility of Kiddushin with other people, meaning with this particular man, she cannot marry. She cannot do Kiddushin, but with other men, it would have been possible. Well, then Havlad Mamzer, that's a situation where the child is going to be a Mamzer. The Ezazeh, what's this situation? Ze'abal al achas mikol ha'arayos shebetorah. This is if somebody has relations with one of the prohibited relations in the Torah. Then that produce, the product of that relationship, will be called a mamzer. So that's category number 3. And category number 4 is v'chol misha ein lo alav v'lo al acherim Kiddushin. Anybody who has no possibility of doing Kiddushin with anyone, that is usually, we'll see that that's going to be somebody who's not Jewish. Havlad Kamosa. So then the child is like her. Vlad Shivcha Benachos. This is the child of a non-Jewish woman, or a non-Jew, or a slave who is a woman, non-Jewish slave who is a woman. So in those situations, in those 2 situations, that child is going to be like her. We're not going to follow the man. And so, this again gives us the general quality that we all have heard before, that we say that when you have a Jew marrying a non-Jew, and the non-Jew, and if the mother is the one who's not Jewish, then the child is not Jewish. And that's, and so that is the story there. So, kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin, Amar le Rabbi Shimon le Rabbi Yochanan, Klalahu, that this language of everyone who where there is Kiddushin and there's no Avera, so then that is a broad category. De kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ein Avera, havlad holech achar zachar. So that is, that's the general rule. So hare, as we turn to Samach Zayin Aleph, ger shenasa mamzeres the yesh Kiddushin ve'ein averes. Well, ve'ein avera. Well, 1 second, I can give you an example of a situation where it seems like the rule applies. Namely, there's marriage, but no avera, and that's a situation where a convert marries a mamzeret. A male convert marries somebody who is born from these improper, out of wedlock relationships. So havlad holech achar apagum. But we still say, even though the man in this situation, this ger, is a totally kosher person, we still say that the child follows the blemish, meaning that the child would be a mamzer. Titania ger shenasa mamzeres habad mamzer. We divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says that the convert who marries a mamzeres, the child is a mamzer, even though Rabbi Yossi also says that that's a legal marriage. So we have a violation of our first rule. So you said at the very beginning of the rule that every situation is like it. So how could that be true? It's not true. So Amar Le, so Rabbi Yochanan explained to Rabbi Shimon, Misvarat Masnisin Rabbi Yossi. Are you telling you thought that the Mishnah was like Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Masnisin Rabbi Yehuda he the Amar. Our Mishnah is actually like Rabbi Yehuda, who's the one who says ger lo yisa mamzeres, that a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeret. And so as a result, because a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeret, so therefore it no longer is in category number 1. it's now in category number 2. And so as a result, because it's in category number 2, where there is marriage, but it's not allowed, what do we say? We say we follow the one who is the pugum. And so therefore, that's why we're going to follow the mother, and therefore the child will also be a mamzer. It just follows rule number 2. So vinisne. Well, 1 second. When we came to rule number 2, where we talked about what kinds of cases are situations where there's marriage and a transgression, we did not mention this case of a ger marrying a mamzer, so a mamzeret. So why not? So tana kol makom the seifa la'asuye. So no, well, the point is that again, the kol makom language that we had at the beginning of rule number 2, where it says every case, that teaches us that there are cases that we're not going to list that have this rule, and this is an additional case that follows that rule. So that's answer number 1 to Rabbi Shimon's question. Again, Rabbi Shimon's question is, I had an example where it seems there was something that should follow rule number 1, but it doesn't actually follow rule number 1. It follows the rule number 2. So how could you say that? So that was, and the answer is that this Mishnah is not according to Rabbi Yossi. So for Iboy Yisema, or you could say, well, Olam Rabbi Yossi, actually, our Mishnah is like Rabbi Yossi. The Tana ezazu lema'ute. And the point is that the second half of each of our first 2 cases use this question of which case is this? And the language of which case is this implies that there may be a case that formally fits the clarification, the categorization, but doesn't actually fit the rule. And that's what we're saying. We're saying, which case is this? It's only the case of a daughter of a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael who marries a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael. And we are excluding from that category, the case of a convert marrying a mamzeret. And so actually our Mishnah is consistent with Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so now that we have these 2 answers, we are going to spend much of the rest of today. And Rashi actually has a nice explanation here. So let's take a look at the Rashi, 2 to 3 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. We'll read the language of the Gemara and then go into the Rashi. Really, we could say it's actually even Rabbi Yossi. Da'amar ger mutar b'mamzeret. He's the one who says that a convert is allowed to marry a mamzeret. Klalahi. Masnisin, and that which you asked, that our Mishnah seems to have a broad general rule. Lav klaya kyle dilahachi tanaba. Masnisin lav klala kyle. It's not. It doesn't actually include everything. Dilahachi tanaba ve'ezazu. Ve'ezazu. Which case is this? Meaning the fact that we ask which case shows that not every case that meets the general rule, that meets the categorization, will have the general rule apply to it. And zuhi ko enes v'levia, etc. Hulu lememra, which comes to tell us the hanihu dahavlad holech achar hazachar. It's only in those cases that the child follows the father. Aval yesh acherim, but there are other cases, apal pisha yesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera, that even though there is a valid Kiddushin, a valid marriage, but there is no sin, havlad holach achar hapagam, that the child will follow the blemished parent and not always the father. So now that we've said that the general rule is not what we should follow according to Rabbi Yossi, but rather we should recognize that the end of the Mishnah, the end of the language of each of the rules in the Mishnah, shows some level of exclusion. So we're going to now ask on this, I don't understand. You said that everything, that all cases is not inclusive, and the asking of the which cases is exclusive to show that there are others. But 1 second, I can show that there be'ezuzu besulo. That implies that only the cases that we list are cases where there's marriage and no sin, and we follow the father. I'm going to give you another case where there's marriage and no sin, and we don't, and we follow the father. So, because take a look at this, if you have a chalal kohen who marries a regular Jew, the yesh kedushin, the ein avera, there is marriage and there's no sin associated with it. Havlad holech achar hazachar. The child follows the father, meaning that just as the father was a chalal kohen is a kohen who is the offspring of a kohen marrying a divorcee. So that should and a couple of other cases as well. So that seems like, again, we have a category. We have a case that fits the category and follows the rule, and yet you've effectively said that our Azazu is supposed to be totally inclusive. So hello, Kasha. No, that's not such a problem, because could the Rebbe Dostai ben Rabbi Yehuda Svirale, it could follow Rabbi Dostai. What does Rabbi Dostai say? Because we're not going to mention it right away. Latana Didan to Amar, because we're going to see it in a little while, and maybe a week or so. That Benos Yisrael mikvah tahara l'chalin ubitak sheru l'kahuna. We're going to say that actually in that situation the it does not follow our general rule, and the child. We say that the women of Israel have the ability to purify a halal, and thereby the daughter of such a marriage will actually be able to marry a Kohen and will not be considered a halalah. And so as a result, if in fact she's not a halalah, that means she's not following the father. And so here we have an exception to the rule. And so that's why it wasn't taught with the Azazu cases, because it isn't actually following the rule. It does not follow the rule, and that's why it isn't mentioned. All right, so V'harei Yisrael Shenasa Chalala. Well, 1 second. What if we reverse the situation? We have another case that again seems like it should be enumerated, but it is not. And we're going to have 3 of these cases, we'll see. So the case is the following. V'harei Yisrael Shenasa Chalala. We have a Jew who marries a Jewish man who marries a chalala, meaning the daughter of a kohen with a divorcee, and again, there's marriage and there's no transgression, because the Jewish man that we're talking about is not a kohen. So, and yet the child is and like the father, meaning that the child is not a chalala. So, v'harei Yisrael shenasa chalala to yesh kedushin ve'ein avera v'avlad holach achar hazachar. So again, shouldn't that be listed? So Tana kol makom dereisha la'asuye. You know what? We're going to change our answer, maybe even with respect to question number 1 as well. And the point is that we're going to use both aspects of our Mishnah. We're going to say that every case at the beginning teaches us that the listing of at the end is not complete. And the which case at the end is telling us that there are some cases that might look like they fall into the category, but they do not. So V'nisnei behedya. What was that?
Wins.
Who wins? So right now, the winner is the fact that our Mishnah, we understand our Mishnah better. So we are the winners in this case. So the Kohen, if he marries a divorcee, so then the child is going to be a chalal or a chalalah, depending if it's a boy or a girl. And if a Kohen marries a regular Kohen, a Kohenet, Leviah or Yisraelit, well, then the child will be a Kohen. So and in which case everybody wins. So v'nisnei behedja. So why not teach this rule explicitly? So mishum delo masnila, because it would not be easy to teach. Because if you wanted to teach it, how would you teach it? Because what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said, right? Kohenes Levia v'Yisraelit, Shenisna leKohen Levi v'Yisrael. It used a very brief language, because what is included in this 3 situation. 9 different cases are included in those 7 words. Because we get, out of those 7 words, we get a Kohen married to a Kohen. We get a Kohenet married to a Kohen. We get a Kohenet married to a Levi. We get a Kohenet married to Yisrael. We get a Leviah married to a Kohen, a Leviah married to a Levi, a Leviah married to Yisrael. And we get a Yisraelite married to a Kohen, Yisraelite married to a Levi, and Yisraelite married to a Yisrael. So we get 9 different cases. Now, if you wanted to try and add in the word chalalah, where the point is that a chalalah who marries either a Yisrael or a Levi, the child of that will not be a chalalah, and it will be all okay. The problem is that if you add chalalah to the beginning category and you say kohenes uleviyav Yisraelit v'chalalah shenisus lekohen Levi Yisrael chalalah lekohen michazya, is a chalalah actually able to marry a kohen? No, that is the one situation that is prohibited. And so as a result, in order to add this case, you would have to just basically add it as a new separate category. You wouldn't be able to add it as to the framework that was already being used. You would have to say the chalalah shenisus Levi v'Yisrael. Now, that wouldn't be that many additional words, but the point is it would take away from the beauty of the parallel language in our Mishnah. And so as a result, that's why it was the Mishnah chose not to list it and to just include it in the category of other cases. So again, trying to highlight more cases that seem to follow the rule of our Mishnah, but are not listed at the end of our Mishnah. Mitzri Sheni Shinasa Mitzvahs Rishona. What happens if you have an Egyptian who has converted? Now, the rule associated with Egyptians who convert, and this doesn't apply today because all of the countries around the world have been mixed up in terms of where they're actually originally from. And so as a result, a convert who is today an Egyptian, I don't believe, would follow this rule. But it used to be, when we knew who the Egyptians really were, that an Egyptian who converted could not marry a Jewish person, a Jewish person from birth, until after 3 generations. Only the 3rd generation would be allowed to marry. So now what's the question is what happens in the following situation? We have an Egyptian who has been Jewish for 1 generation, meaning they converted. And we have an Egyptian who has been Jewish for 2 generations, meaning that their parent converted before they were born. And so now we have the situation where it's a 2nd generation Egyptian man who marries a 1st generation Egyptian woman. What's the story with their child? Do we follow the father, meaning that the child would be a 3rd generation Egyptian man, or do we follow the mother, meaning that the child would be a 2nd generation Egyptian convert? And the answer is Banash Lishi Havi. We say that we follow the father, and so the child is the 3rd generation. So here we have another case where, again, the marriage is a legal marriage. A 1st generation Egyptian woman is allowed to marry a 2nd generation Egyptian man who has converted to Judaism, and we have no sin associated with it. There's no aveira associated. The only aveira would be if either of them were to marry a regular Jew. So, and yet we see that we follow the father, which is exactly the rule that we said in the 1st category. So so how do we answer it? Meaning, why wasn't this case listed? So again, Tana Kol Makom Deresha L'Asuye. The fact is that we said every case at the very beginning in order to include it. Well, Rav Dimi de Amar Sheni Have. Well, 1 second. What about according to Rav Dimi? Rav Dimi is the one who says that the offspring of such a marriage between a 2nd generation man and a 1st generation woman follows the mother. So this means that it's an exception. So Tana Ezuzu Lamaute. Well, in that case, he'll explain our Mishnah by saying that the Ezuzu at the end of the 1st category comes to exclude this case and to tell you that It's only the case that's listed and not this case that is covered by the rule that we follow the father. Okay. So that was three questions that we asked on are trying to say that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi, and the which case is telling us that we're excluding other cases. But now we note that one second, according to but there's another case that involves marriage and no sin, but does not follow the father. And so now we're going back to our original question and saying, hey, you said in our case that every case means that there's broader category, or that at least it always applies. How do you understand the following situation? When Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Be'umos halach achar hazachar. Now, we're not going to understand the case that we're about to say until about 15 minutes from now. Then we'll understand the case, but we'll just translate it now, and then we'll dive in deeper in a moment. And I'll tell you what the case is, but we'll really not understand it until we get to a little further in the Gemara. So when you have other nations that marry each other, so then halach achar hazachar, we follow the father. This Gairu, if those other nations actually convert to Judaism and we now have them married to each other, halach achar hapagum shebishnehem, then you follow the blemished among them. Well, one second, that second part of that rule, that's a situation where you have two converts marrying each other, totally a legitimate marriage, legitimate Kiddushin, and you have no Avera, and yet we follow the blemish. We're following rule number 2, not rule number 1. So it seems like this is an exception. So how can we understand it? So Tana Ezazu Lema'ute. No, that point is that again, we have now highlighted the fact that we've got both an exclusionary language in our Mishnah and an inclusionary language in our Mishnah. And so as a result, whenever we have something that doesn't fit the rule, that's what the exclusionary language was coming to do. And anytime we have something that should have been listed but wasn't listed, that's what the inclusionary language comes to do. And so that's what we're saying here. It's the exclusionary language. So hi mai. So now we're going to back up and we're going to say, we've come up with two different approaches, and we're going to now challenge the Rebbe Yossi approach. Remember, back all the way when we started, we had the first situation where we said every case includes a regular Jew, and we asked, we've now sort of gone through and we've listed a whole bunch of cases that get extra included and a whole bunch of cases that get excluded, and we're going to use those situations, both according to Rabbi Yehuda and according to Rabbi Yossi, to say the Rabbi Yossi answer doesn't seem to fit as well. So let's take a look and we'll see it inside. Hi, Mai. Now, if you say, according to the very first answer, remember all the way back when we just began the Gemara, we said that the explanation of the situation what about a male convert who marries a mamzeret, where we say there's no a valid marriage and no transgression, and yet, according to Rabbi Yossi, and the child follows the mother and is a mamzeret, and we said no, it's Rabbi Yehuda, it's a transgression and it follows the mother because it's part of rule 2. So using that answer of the fact that it's really Rabbi Yehuda and it's part and a ger marrying a mamzeret is part of rule 2, then listen, you'll see that the categorizations make a lot of sense, because because the inclusionary language of the very first category, where we say that we're talking about a marriage and no sin, Yisrael shenasa chalala, that comes to include a Jew who marries a chalala, Udu Rabba Bar Barchana, and the case of Rabba Bar Barchana. And remember, the case of Rabba Bar Barchana is a case where a second-generation Egyptian man and marries a first-generation Egyptian woman, where we follow the father. And Ezuzu l'ma'ute d'Rabdimi v'Ravin, and the Ezuzu, the exclusionary language, comes to exclude the cases of Rav Dimi, who says that a second-generation Egyptian man and a first-generation Egyptian woman follows the mother, and Ravin, who says two converted non-Jews, as the Gemara will explain, follows the one who has the blemish. And so as a result, that all makes sense. And in addition, as we turn to Samach Zayin Amabet, Kol Makom de Seifa, the inclusionary language of the second case of our Mishnah, La'asuye, comes to include Ger Shenasa Mamzeret. It includes a convert who marries a Mamzeret, where we say that even though that it's prohibited and it's but it is a valid marriage, and we follow the pugum. We follow the one that's not appropriate, and that means that the child is a mamzer, and so that works out perfectly. But Ela'i Amrat Rebbe Yossi, if you say that our Mishnah is Rebbe Yossi, Kol Makom Dereisha Kida Amran, the inclusionary language that we said, does the inclusionary things that we already mentioned, and Ezazu Kida Amran Ela Kol Makom Deseifa La'asuye Mai, and the inclusionary language comes to, and the exclusionary language also follows the rules that we just said, but the case that we began with this for the second situation, right? The case of Ger Shenasa Mamzeret, now we have a problem because Ger Shenasa Mamzeret is not included in the every case of the second rule, meaning that in the second rule, we have an inclusionary language that we don't have anything to put in that basket. So we haven't added anything to the list of items that are mentioned in the Mishnah. And so that seems to be a problem according to our understanding of Rabbi Yossi. So Ela Kol Makom Deseifa La'asuyimai, what case does it include? So the Gemara answers no. You're misunderstanding, because just because we have additional the possibility of an additional case to be included, maybe there's another reason for the Gemara, for the Mishnah using that language. Let's take a look and see what that reason would be. So Ula Taimech Rabbi Yehuda Ezazu to Seifa Lamali. Well, 1 second. You want to say that everything makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda has not come up with a case that
have a plan.
We're working on it. We're going to explain the plan in a moment. Rabbi Yehuda does not have a case that fits the second category, right? The second category is where the marriage is valid, but there's a sin, and does not fit the rule. The rule is that we follow the pugum, we follow the blemish. So, and we should have such a case because we ask the question, Ezazu. Ezazu seems to suggest that we should have a case that meets the category but doesn't meet the rule. And yet we don't have such a case. So how can you understand even according to Rabbi Yehuda? So Ella, Idi Tanaresha Ezazu. So what is it? So the answer is that actually the usage of that language is just to create a parallelism. We have a reason to use Ezazu in the first case, because Ezazu in the first case highlights the fact that there are some situations where there's a valid marriage and no sin, and yet we don't follow the father. So as a result of actually having a valid usage of Ezazu in the first case, we will use that same language of Ezazu in the second case, even though we don't have anything that we're excluding. So Hachinami, Idi de Tana Reisha Kol Makom, Taninami Seva Kol Makom. So according to Rabbi Yossi, we can use that same rationale with respect to the Kol Makom language. That once we use Kol Makom to highlight that some things follow the rule, even though they aren't explicitly listed in our Mishnah, we will use that same language in the second case, even though there aren't things that aren't listed in the Mishnah that follow the same rule. So as a result, we've now explained the Mishnah. So now we're going to go back and address the question, that the case that Ravin mentioned, right? We said that Ravin said that if you have two non-Jews marrying, we follow the father, and if we have two non-Jews who convert, we follow the one that has the blemish. So what did all of that actually mean? So let's take a look. So, Gufa, Kiyas and Rabban, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We said that when Rabban came to Eretz Yisrael, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but Umos, when it comes to the other nations, halach achar hazachar, you follow the father. Niskairu, if they convert, halach achar hapagam shebishneim, you follow the one that is more blemished. So my be'umos halach achar hazachar. What case are we talking about? Kiddushin. So I'm going to tell you the case. It's the one that is discussed in the following brisa. How do I know that if someone from some nation other than the nations of the Shivas Amimim that of Canaan, from the 7 Canaanite nations, Shabal HaKananus V'Holid Ben, that if he then has relations with this Canaanite woman and they have a son, that you're allowed to buy him as a slave. Now, what is the implication of that? Rashi highlights it for us. My be'umos Allah halach achar hazachar. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's this is a different point that Rashi was making. So we'll keep going. So the point is that but when it says sha'atar shaylich no, so be'ebed, it's let's see, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 lines down in Rashi. Sha'ata rishaylik no, so be'ebed dishadinan lay basar zachar umuter lachayosam, that you follow the father and you are allowed to allow them to live, because when it comes to the 7 Canaanite nations, we have a mitzvah to destroy them. They're not allowed to live once they have chosen to fight with us. And so as a result, because they are not allowed to live, if in fact we would follow the mother, well, then we would have to kill this child. The point is that we say that you're allowed to buy this child as a slave to tell us that in fact this child does not have to be killed. Okay, so as a result, the point is that when a Canaanite woman marries a non-Canaanite man, we follow the man. So Talmud Lomer, and how do we know that? Because the Gam Mibnei Hatoshavim Hagarim Imachem Mehem Tiknu, that the Torah, when it tells you about the ability to buy non-Jewish slaves, it says that you can also buy them from among the children of the men who come to live with you. Meaning a man came from outside the land of Israel, and whoever he marries, even if it's somebody that is a woman from the Canaanite nations, the child of that is allowed to be your slave. So Yachol af Eved. Maybe you might think the same thing is true in the case of the other way, where you have a Canaanite slave, Shaba al Shivcha min ha'umos v'holid ben, where you have a Eved Kanani who now has relations with a maidservant from other nations and now has a child, meaning the woman is from other nations. Sha'ata Rashai lekanoso be'ebed, that you're allowed to purchase the child as a slave. So Talmud and you don't have to kill them. So Talmud Lomer asher holidu ba'artzachem. No, it's only those who are begotten in your land. And so the point is that they need to be those that are born in your land and not those who just live in your land. Meaning that because the Gemara assumes that in fact wherever the daughter is, wherever the wife is from, that's where the couple is likely to end up. And so as a result, if the child is the child of a female non-Canaanite, non-Jew, and a male Canaanite Jew, so then we're talking about a child who was born outside the land of Israel and then came in to the land of Israel. And so as a result, that's going to be considered a Canaanite. You're not allowed to live with that person, and that person is going to be considered the person who needs to be killed. But the bottom line is that we see that in both of these situations, we have 2 non-Jews who are marrying, and we follow the father. So that is case number 1. Now, what about case number 2? Case number 2, remember, was Nisgairu Halach Achar Hapago Shivishneim. We said that there was the case of they converted, and now you follow the blemished of them. But what case is this talking about? Because if you tell me that it's talking about a male Egyptian convert, remember, who's not allowed to marry a regular Jew until after 3 generations, Shinasa Ammonit, who marries a female Ammonite convert, my Pogomika, what kind of blemish is there? Ammonit below Ammoni below Ammonit. It's the rule is that a Ammoni is not allowed to convert into Judaism, and Ammonite is allowed to convert into Judaism. And so as a result, the child from that relationship is a total Jew. And that can't be what we're talking about, because we got to be having a situation where they're both blemished. And so, I'm sorry. And so, even if the child follows the father, who's an Egyptian convert, and we say that it now is a second generation Egyptian convert, the point is that the rule is that but that the language that Ravin used is that achar hapagum shibishneim, you follow the more blemished of them. So we need to have a situation where both parents have a blemish. So Ella ba'amoni nasa mitzris. We're talking about a situation where there's a male Ammoni who is never allowed to fully convert into be Jewish, meaning that when their children, they are only allowed to marry converts who are not fully Jewish, and who marries a female Egyptian convert. So so, and if the child is male, so what do we do? Shaja Abasra Didei. Well, then we're going to follow the father, because the father is an Ammonite convert, meaning that as long as he's male, he's never allowed to fully convert to Judaism. And so this son will also treat him as an Ammonite convert and is never allowed to fully convert into Judaism. However, if it's a girl that's born, well, then then we have to follow the mother. We have to treat her as a second generation Egyptian, because if we follow the father and we treated her as an Ammoni, well, then she would be able to immediately become Jewish. And so as a result, we need to follow the more blemish. So now we've explained what Ravin's two statements mean. So even though we didn't understand it at the beginning, so now we've clarified it and we understand it at the end. Now we go back to the third rule of our Mishnah. The third rule of our Mishnah was that when Kiddushin is not possible, the child is a mamzer. So we're going to figure out how we know this. Kol she'ein la alav Kiddushin. So again, any situation where there's no Kiddushin possible, so then we said that the offspring is a mamzer. So minahani mili, how do we know this? So we're going to offer effort number one today. And let's see whether effort number one is successful. The Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Matuba Mishum Rabbi Yanai. And some say it was said in the name of Rabbi Yanai. Rav Acha Bre de Ravam and Rav Acha Bre de Rava. Umatuba Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And some say it was said in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So Amar Kra V'Yatza Mibesa V'Halcha V'Haisa L'Ishacher. So what does the Torah say when it comes to a divorcee? It says that she needs to leave his house and she goes to marry somebody else. What's the implication? La'acherim below l'krovim. She's allowed to go to strangers, but she's not allowed to go to relatives with whom she has a kares prohibition. And so the point is that this is teaching us that the concept of marriage does not apply with respect to close relatives. So that's the suggestion for effort number one. So maskif la Rabbi Abba, the ema la'achar below ben. Maybe it's only the son of her former spouse that she's not allowed to marry, and not all close relatives. So no, ben behedja ksiv lape. No, because we have a rule that specifically covers the son of her husband that she would not be allowed to marry, because it says Lo yikach ish as eshes aviv. You're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to take as a wife your father's wife. So acher lamali. So why do I need to say something about another man? Shma mina la'acherim below l'krovim. So again, it teaches us the concept that marriage does not apply to situations where you are attempting to marry a close relative to whom relations is punishable by kares. The Amy Edi Leben. Well, one second, maybe both psukim are talking about a son, right? We have the son, the pasuk of mi beito yatsa mi beito v'achala isa leishacher, and we have the pasuk of lo yikach ishas eshes aviv, and they're really both telling us the same mitzvah, but halachatchila hadiyavad. That one is telling us that you can't marry them lichatchila, you can't marry that son of your father's of the son of your husband. You can't marry him lichatchila, and the other pasuk is telling us that you can't marry him even b'diavad, even after the fact the marriage would not take effect. Even if you tried to do it, it wouldn't work. So no, that's not true because lichatchila me'achos isha nafka. We can learn that the woman is not allowed to marry her husband's son from the fact that a woman is not a man is not allowed to marry the sister of his wife. Uma achos isha b'charis lo tekadesh, just as a man's sister, a man's wife's sister, you're not allowed to marry, and if you do so, you'll be punished by karis. Chayve misos based in lo kol shekain. So any situation where you would be subject to execution, you would certainly be subject to the rule that you're not allowed to marry her even lechatchila. The Amy idi be'alchos isha. Well, one second. Why don't we say that both of these psukim, both the pasuk that talks about not marrying your wife's sister, and the pasuk of v'yatsa mebeso v'halcha v'haisa leishacher, are both talking actually about the sister of one's wife, and halachatchila hadiavad, and one is telling us lichatchila, and the other one is telling us b'diavad. So einachinami, no, you're right. Actually, that maybe that is in fact what we're talking about, and so as a result, ashkechan achos isha shar arayos minalan. And so in fact we say that the pasuk of a wife, the pasuk of not marrying a sister, the sister of your wife, is telling us about lechatchila, and the pasuk of saying that when she gets divorced, she has to marry others, but not close relatives, and that's telling us that even b'diavad it doesn't work. And so as a result, Ashkechan achos isha, we found the rule with respect to a wife's sister, and shar arayos minalan. And how do we know other relations? Yalfin and ma'achos isha. We can learn them all from the wife's sister category. Ma'achos isha miuchedes shehi erva. So just as a wife's sister is considered a forbidden relationship, v'chayav al zindona kares, and you're subject to the kares penalty if you do so intentionally. V'al shigig chatas, and you're subject to a sin offering if you do it inadvertently, if you didn't realize that person that you were sleeping with was your wife's sister. Below tafseba Kiddushin, and there's no Kiddushin that takes effect. Av kol shehi erva v'chayavin al zedona kares v'al shigas chatas lo tafsi be Kiddushin. So we'll learn for every other category where it's an erva relationship and you're subject to kares and you're subject to a chatas if you do it inadvertently. All of those situations will say that marriage doesn't take effect. So close, but it doesn't quite work because bishlam kulu osyan. That works with respect to the vast majority of arayos relationships, but we've got two where it doesn't quite fit because there's going to be exceptions to the rule. Ela eshes ish ve'eshes ach ika lemifrach. We have questions that we can ask about relations with a man's wife and with relations with a brother's wife, because we'll talk about the brother's wife first. Mala achos isha, when it comes to a wife's sister, shekain ain la heter b'makom mitzvah. There is no situation where you're allowed to marry her because of some kind of mitzvah. Meaning that if your brother were to die, if two brothers were married to two sisters, and one of the brothers were to die without a child, so then even though we have this mitzvah of yibum, because the prohibition of marrying your wife's sister will stay in effect, we say that you can't do yibum in that case. And so in fact we say that there isn't even the possibility of doing yibum in that case. And so as a result we see that it always is in effect. But Tomer be'eshes ach, but you can't say that with respect to the wife of your brother. Sheyesh la heter b'makom mitzvah, that when the brother dies without children, so then there is a mitzvah, and therefore you are allowed to marry that situation, even though that's an ordinary erva. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife after your brother passes away if he has children, in an ordinary case. But there's an exception when there's a mitzvah. So that shows a big difference between the case of between that case and a wife's sister. And if there's that kind of difference, we can't learn the story of Ashes, of Achos Isha. I'm sorry, the case of Ashes Ach. Excuse me, Ashes Ach. We can't learn the case of Ashes Ach from Achos Isha, because they have different rules associated with them. And similarly, when it comes to Ashes Ish Nami, with respect to a man's wife, Ikalamifrach, we can ask Malahanach, when it comes to the man's wife, Shekain Ein La Heter B'Chaye Osran. There, when it comes to the wife's sister, there is no permission for the brother for the husband to marry the sister, as long as the wife is alive, even if she were to get divorced. Tomer be'eshes ish, but can you say that about a man's wife? Sheyesh la heter b'chaye osran. You can in fact marry a man's wife while the man is still alive. How? Because he divorced her. So we see that in fact there's a way to do it. So the bottom line is that we cannot learn from Achos Isha to every other case. And so as a result, our first answer must be abandoned. And so now that we've abandoned our first answer, we need to come up with a new one. So, but for that, you'll need to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. So we'll continue. We'll take a look and we'll check right now, but hold on just a second. Let me stop sharing. Let me end our session. Have a great day, everybody.